Welcome everybody to the IISS and to the launch of the Military Balance 2025. We published this 66th edition with war continuing in Europe and against the backdrop of intensifying strategic and military competition and increasing defense spending around the globe. For European states, Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine has been the main driver for greater defense investment. The war also demonstrated increasing connections between European and Asia-Pacific security, apparent not only in North Korea's decision to support Russia's war with about 10,000 troops, China's sale of dual-use technologies to Russia, but also in the growing prominence of South Korea as a defense supplier to European nations, such as Poland. Neither side gained a strategic advantage in the war's third year. Russian forces continue to experience significant casualties and equipment losses for only marginal gains. In our assessment, Russia lost 1,400 main battle tanks in 2024 and over 4,000 since the full-scale invasion in February 2022. Russia also increasingly relied on North Korea and Iran for munitions and materiel. And while its defense industry demonstrated resilience, its current rates of production and the refurbishment of stored vehicles will not offset battlefield losses indefinitely. Indeed, the IISS assesses that Russia will not have sufficient main battle tanks to conduct effective offensive operations beyond early 2026 if it maintains the same operational tempo and suffers the same losses as in 2024. Beyond the significant human and material cost, Russia has increasingly felt the economic burden of the war. IISS analysis shows that Russia's total military expenditure grew by 42% in real terms in 2024 to an estimated $145.9 billion, equivalent to 6.7% of GDP, more than double the average seen before 2022. Furthermore, if we look at Russian spending in purchasing power parity terms, it is closer to $462 billion, which exceeds total European spending in 2024. That said, Ukraine's strategic position also did not improve, and its forces were increasingly strained by attrition and recruitment challenges. Its inadequate combat mass has driven focus on fast innovation cycles, developing a growing range of UAVs and using one-way attack UAVs to strike deep inside Russia. Ukraine's ability to rapidly develop, iterate, and manufacture battlefield technologies has prompted many Western defense companies to consider how they can learn from Ukraine's approach. But while these attacks have highlighted vulnerabilities in Russia's air defenses, targeted military supplies, and affected the oil revenues on which it is so dependent, they will not be decisive. And despite greater freedoms to use some of the advanced weaponry supplied by its partners and the limited entry into service of F-16 aircraft, Ukrainian forces have made little progress in retaking further territory. This situation has left Ukraine in an increasingly precarious situation, and the strategic options are narrowing, given US President Trump's pledge to end the war quickly. For Ukraine to effectively counter Russia's aggression, international support would have to increase significantly beyond current levels to ensure that offensives could be maintained. US leadership will remain vital, including for the provision of a credible security guarantee for Ukraine as a precondition for a stable ceasefire agreement. The 15-month-long war between Israel, Hamas, and its allies brought far-reaching consequences and drew in regional and extra-regional actors. In maintaining operations in both Gaza and Lebanon, the Israel Defense Forces were stretched, with reserve brigades mobilized throughout the war and conscription expanded to previously exempt communities. Still, the IDF managed to significantly degrade Hamas and Hezbollah, though the prospect of a lasting peace in Gaza remains dim. Moreover, compounded by the collapse of the Assad regime in Syria in December, Iran's strategic position in the region weakened significantly. Its large-scale attacks against Israel in April and October failed to significantly damage military or civilian infrastructure. In fact, these attacks demonstrated the utility of modern integrated air and missile defense capabilities, including against ballistic missiles, even though Israel required international assistance to fully address these threats. Iran's greater vulnerability raises questions about Tehran's response, including the possibility that it might further accelerate its enrichment of uranium for the purpose of achieving weapons-grade material. China's military modernization remains striking in its pace and scope, and the 2025 military balance contains a new wall chart, which you can see here illustrating these trends. In some areas, China's armed forces overmatch its regional rivals and gradually erode the United States' advantage. Important areas of PLA progress include cyber and electronic warfare, missiles, and advanced combat aircraft. Late in the year, 2 new combat aircraft designs were unveiled, and we assess that at least 230 low observable Chengdu J-20 multi-role combat aircraft are now in service. The PLA also conducted increasingly complex military exercises around Taiwan in 2024 and intensified joint drills with Russian forces, including in the Western Pacific. That said, ongoing corruption campaigns affecting PLA senior officers and the decision to restructure the Strategic Support Force indicate that the PLA is still in the process of becoming a military that is capable of integrated joint operations at scale. In response, several Asia-Pacific powers have pressed ahead with modernization and procurement efforts and thought to increase their defense industrial cooperation. For instance, Japan committed to fundamentally reinforce its defense capabilities, based more capabilities on its southwestern islands close to Taiwan, and pursued new standoff missile systems. Tokyo also submitted a bid to construct Australia's next-generation frigates and intensified its collaboration with the UK and Italy on the development of a 6th-generation combat aircraft. In response to the deteriorating security environment, 2024 saw increases in defense spending in all regions, bar sub-Saharan Africa. Global defense spending rose from $2.24 trillion in 2023 to $2.46 trillion in 2024, constituting a real terms increase of 7.4%. European defense spending increased for the 10th successive year, surging by almost 12% in real terms, with modernization and recapitalization still the major focus of uplifts. The average allocation to investment within European defense budgets is now 30% compared to 15% a decade ago, although much of this shift is evident in procurement rather than R&D. The 23.2% growth in Germany's defense budget made it the 4th largest in the world in 2024, outspending France and the UK, while Poland climbed the ranks to become the 15th largest defense spender. But defense spending in Europe remained inconsistent. While in Poland and the Baltic states defense budgets exceeded 3% of GDP, others, such as Spain and Italy, continue to spend well under the NATO 2% baseline. European NATO allies will come under increased pressure from the new Trump administration to spend even more. IISS data shows that current NATO defense spending stands at $1.44 trillion, with Europe's $442 billion accounting for less than 1/3 of the total. A commitment to 3% across the alliance's European members would see that figure jump to $716 billion and almost treble to $1.2 trillion if 5% were achieved. Such increases are unlikely given that the major concern in Europe is the sustainability of current defense spending increases at a time of significant fiscal pressures across the continent. Steady growth continued in the Asia-Pacific, reaching 5.4% in real terms, although this was somewhat bolstered by the 7% growth in China spending. Indeed, persistently higher growth rates in China compared to the wider region mean that its budget accounted for 44% of the region's total in 2024, up from 38% a decade ago. While the region's share of global spending fell, it remained above Europe's. Lastly, budgets in the Middle East and North Africa grew by nearly 10%, driven mainly by a 73% real terms surge in Israeli spending. After being caught back-footed following the outbreak of the war in Ukraine, the defense industry in the West struggled to increase production quickly, and challenges remain, notably around workforce shortages, supply chain bottlenecks, and still nascent order books. A range of disruptors who have entered the sector over the last decade, such as Anduril in the US and Helsing in Europe, have been quick to point to these difficulties as proof that a new, more agile approach to delivering defense capability is needed. In 2024, members of this new cohort of players unveiled systems intended to address pressing concerns for militaries, such as loitering munitions and autonomous systems. They received significant investment from the private sector, with Anduril's latest funding round in August valuing the company at $14 billion. These firms' order books remain relatively small, but the support they seem to have and their promise to quickly innovate and to rapidly scale production is challenging traditional defense primes over how to adapt amid a groundswell of support excuse me, in the US and Europe for innovation in defense and embrace of a Silicon Valley-like approach. To conclude, the fragile security environment highlighted in these opening remarks places a premium on the provision of accurate and impartial defense information. This work remains vital to the mission of the IISS. The 2025 military balance that we launched today and the open source data in our Military Balance Plus database is a major contribution to understanding strategic and military dynamics in over 170 countries, military spending around the world, defense procurements, as well as deployments and exercises. And with that, I will close and invite you to ask questions. We have a panel of experts here, many of them known to you, contributors to the military balance, and we're joined also by a couple of other IISS colleagues who will help address your questions. We also, I should say, have an online audience who also have the ability to ask questions, and my colleague Hugh here to my immediate right will keep an eye out for those questions. So we might take a mix of questions in the room and from the online audience. And once a microphone finds you, it would be great if you could quickly introduce yourself and let us know your affiliation. So with that, I'll open the floor for questions. So I've got a question over here.
Hi there. I'm Lucia McKenzie. I'm a data journalist at Politico. I have a question about the statistic you gave on Russian military expenditure, that it has now, in purchasing power parity terms, slightly exceeded Europe's overall defense spending. Could you elaborate on whether that's been the case for several years or a long time, or if this is just a result of the war in Ukraine? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Fenella, can I ask you to take that?
Thank you for the question. The PPP comparison is important to make, just to take into account the lower domestic input costs that Russia has. It's a difficult comparison because it would not be suitable to make the similar conversions for European spending. But it's a good indicator of why Russia is able to fund so much more with a seemingly smaller budget in US dollar terms. So the PPP figure is matching European defence spending in dollar terms. This hasn't been the case previously. It really is the result of remarkable growth in Russian defence spending. We had 18% in 2022 and 23, and obviously the 42% figure that we've had in 2024. 2025 growth looks to be a bit more moderate, closer to 15%, perhaps reflecting the fact that the tempo, at such a high rate of tempo, can be quite difficult to maintain, certainly in terms of wider economic issues now facing Russia. But I think the pace of growth, the scale of industrial reform and the reorientation of spending has been remarkable. But that's not to say that the challenges facing Russia's defence industrial output, for a start, aren't significant. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And if we can we have a question there. Yeah, right there, and then we'll come to the front. Thank you.
Good morning, Thomas Harding, the security editor for The National. Just to embellish on some of the points you made, you're saying that the Ukraine casualty figures are significantly higher than we've previously thought. The latest figure Zelensky gave was 45,000 dead. I just wondered what your view is on that, on how much higher they are. And the second thing is the Iran use of ballistic missiles and drones in Ukraine. You're saying that's increasing as well. Could you just sort of slightly go into detail on that, please?
Thank you very much. Maybe I'll ask Henry to start, and then Douglas, if you want to take the second part. Yeah, Henry.
I think the question is exactly where the Ukrainian casualty figure lies and what you mean by casualties and the distinction between dead, seriously wounded. There's sort of been in discussion over the last 3 years of this war. There's been significantly less open source information, intentionally, released on Ukrainian casualty figures than discussion of Russian ones. But I think that shouldn't underlie the serious level of casualties Ukraine has suffered. And even if it's not using manpower at quite the same rate Russia is in its infantry-intensive offensive operations over the last year, it has also seen a significant uptick in its own casualty rates. It's simply in the question mark of defending against such a significant sustained attritional campaign by Russia. I think there are question marks not just about overall level of manning in the frontline Ukrainian units, but how do you sustain that going forward? And I think that's one of the key questions Ukraine is now facing, is how it throughputs manpower it does have, or personnel it does have available, to make sure that particularly its frontline infantry units are sustained. And our current assessment is they're somewhere between 50 and 100,000 personnel short of where they should be at establishment. And I think that's one of the key challenges that Zelensky is going to face coming into 2025. On the just quickly on the equipment side, I think you've seen both in terms of to a lesser extent the Iranian supply that's come through in terms of the additional ballistic missile systems and some of the North Koreans, but particularly that ammunition supply from North Korea has been key to how Russia has maintained its tempo of operations, its traditional reliance on artillery shell. I think we're looking at somewhere in the range of 8 million shells across 18 months from North Korea from starter supply. I think the estimates would be dependent on kind of crate to ammunition round estimates, so it will vary depending on exactly what you shipped. But that's something in the region of almost double what Russia's annual national output would be over a 12-month period. And it gives you a sense of how important North Korea has been in terms of material supply to Russia's war effort.
Douglas, do you want to?
Yeah, Thomas, just on the uninhabited side of the house, obviously the Russian Goran is a clone of the Iranian Shahed. They're boosting manufacture. There looks like to be additional manufacturing sites being put together. It's predominantly used as a decoy. Over half of them seem to be simply decoys, but that doesn't mean that your defences can ignore it. You've got to be pretty confident it's a decoy before you leave it alone.
Thank you very much. If we can come to the second row and then all the way to the front. Gentleman over here.
I'm Hidemitsu Kibe from Nikkei. I have a question about Iran's nuclear capability. And what is the latest estimation of the breakout time for Iran to acquire nuclear bomb? And is it technically possible to extend that time by military or cyber operation?
Okay. Maybe I'll ask Emil Horkayem to put a bit of context around that question, and then we'll turn to the panel here to address some of the more. Yeah, Emil.
Thank you. Obviously, at present, there is a lot of attention paid to Iran's enrichment of uranium and possible brinkmanship.
Sorry, can I ask you to stand up just for the camera?
Obviously, there's a lot of attention paid to that issue because Iran's setbacks in other domains. There is not full clarity about Iran's progress at the moment. And the breakout time is quite a controversial matter. Estimates go from a few weeks to many months. And it's not clear that Iran would have enough material for more than one or two devices. So, 6 months is, the 4 to 6 months is the estimate that's out there, provided that Iran makes that decision. It's not clear yet. This is going to be the year where Iran will have to consider to what extent to push on the nuclear front.
Thanks, Emil. Do we want to add to that here? Yeah? Who wants to go first? Ben?
Over the last 20 years, we've seen a lot of efforts, much of which has been attributed to Israel, to, as you say, extend the breakout time. And that's include targeted killings of nuclear experts and engineers, some of which have been quite innovative. It also included the Stuxnet cyber attack. You can be quite certain that Iran will have greatly strengthened its cyber defences. And I'd imagine that Israeli intelligence is as active in Iran as it's always been.
Douglas, did you want to add as well?
Yes, just very briefly, obviously alongside the device, you've got to think about the delivery mechanism and the packaging, neither of which are easily done, so they obviously add to the timeline as well.
Thank you very much. So let's take a question here in the front. Yes, right here.
Peter Apps, Reuters. I mean, lots of really interesting stuff here. I'm struck by this idea that if the Ukraine war continues for another year, Russia will run out of tanks and Ukraine will run out of people. But to sort of take it up one level, Russia, if it's able to maintain the spending, is outpacing Europe. China is outpacing Asia. And we haven't talked about the US so far, but particularly Pete Hegseth, the new Secretary of Defense, seems to be talking very clearly about prioritizing homeland defense, the border, putting a lot more US military, whatever Iron Dome might look like for the US, which I get the impression is probably more a counter long-range missile shield than a short-range. I'd really like Douglas's thought on that. So I guess sort of three questions to Ben, Meyer, and Douglas. Ben, I mean, what does Europe look like in that environment where Russia is, particularly if the fighting stops this year and the Russians don't run out of tanks? They're presumably in that case going to build a lot more tanks very quickly because they're not going to be using them up in the same kind of way. And that outpacing European production is going to continue. Meyer, obviously the same question, more in the naval space in Asia. And Doug, what do we actually think the Americans want to achieve with this shield? And to what extent does that allow them, as potentially with the SDI in the 1980s, which worried Thatcher a lot, to pull away from the rest of the world?
Thank you very much. Let's perhaps start there, Douglas, and then we'll work our way to the other questions. And I think maybe Henry and Nick also want to get in on some of these. Douglas.
Sure. Thanks, Peter, for the question. Obviously, Iron Dome, as you mentioned, it sounds more like SDI Mark II. So you then have to ask what level of protection do the Americans actually want to pursue? Once you know that, what do you actually think is achievable? Obviously, there are a variety of views, as we saw with the first time round the Houses, on just how well you can protect and who you're trying to protect against. A limited strike from a small country you can probably deal with. I think as a partial aside, I think that sometimes the level of success we saw in Israel kind of favoured the defender greatly in terms of dealing with ballistic and cruise threats. You were defending a very small footprint. You kind of knew where the systems were coming from. Obviously, trying to defend continental US is a completely different issue, far, far harder. So again, it's a question of what the Americans think is actually achievable. Is that a concern in terms of the way that Margaret Thatcher saw there was a risk of a disconnect? I think at least theoretically, yes, but again, that comes back to how far the Americans want to go and how far they think they've actually managed to achieve what they wanted to.
Thank you, Doug. Maybe Ben and Henry, I can ask you to address that Europe part, and then Maya and Nick can tackle the China and Asia naval bits.
There's quite a lot of speculation that Secretary Hesketh will make remarks along the lines that the US is no longer going to be the primary security guarantor to Europe because its priorities are elsewhere. Well, that will reinforce the urgency of Europe doing more for its own defence. There has been some European rearmament since 2022, and we've chronicled that in successive editions of the book, including the latest one. But European governments have stark choices. How much of their current capability do they actually take from their own front line and give to Ukraine, like the UK gave all its medium artillery, Sweden gave a large number of its CV-90s, and of stuff that's coming off the production line, ammunition and equipment, how much of that they send to Ukraine and how much do they use to build up their own capabilities. But if the US is clear that it's going to do much less militarily in Europe, the imperative is there for European militaries to accelerate their modernisation and also rebuilding their numbers.
Henry?
Speaking on the side of the Russian side in terms of Russian capability, I think that kind of where you get to in terms of a post-war Russian military is still a really interesting question. One of which goes into question is what does post-war look like? A ceasefire or something that leaves the fundamental issues of Ukrainian sovereignty unresolved, and Russia still has to maintain a sizable force on Ukraine's border, complicates its force posture elsewhere. I think even if the war would end tomorrow, hypothetically, there are finite limits on Russia's ability to draw upon existing stockpiles, as it has been doing, to reconstitute armour artillery forces. I think that kind of a post-war Russia falls several questions in terms of its sustained military and defence industrial investment, how much it's prepared to maintain a kind of wartime level of production and investment in the defence, and how that feeds into how long it takes the armed forces to capitalise, how big it wants its armed forces to be eventually. It does have quite ambitious plans. It's been talking about, during the course of the war, for a post-war force significantly larger than it went into the conflict with, ostensibly a kind of a return to a Soviet-style sized armed force for Russia, with obviously a smaller resource base to start with, and test something that we really haven't seen them do very much of on the armoured vehicle front, which is new build. At some point in this, to build out this force, Russia is either going to have to significantly expand its new build production of armoured vehicles across the board if it wants to maintain an armoured force, rather than a very infantry-heavy kind of equivalent to what it's currently using, or in some way or shape or form find a way of importing capability from elsewhere in the world. I think those are two things that we haven't really seen a kind of a clear answer to from within the Russian establishment about where they're planning to go with that at the moment.
Thank you very much. Who wants to start, Nick or Maya? Nick, do you want to kick off on this one? Yeah.
Yeah, I'll kick off on the China-US balance, if you like, particularly in the context of the naval and maritime space. And as we're recording in the book, the Chinese naval modernization continues apace, with probably significant deliveries recently, not least in the amphibious shipping space, but also the expectation of significant submarine capability uplift going forward with new designs coming in. That's all based and is being fueled in significant ways by a very significant broad Chinese shipbuilding industrial base, and this has become part of the issues around the United States' efforts, and particularly those of the US Navy, to respond to this. And it's been clear for some time that the US and the US Navy has been challenged in its response, and we've seen this in the way that plans and ambitions have evolved. That has focused a significant degree of concern and attention on the US in industrial base and capacity, and trying to move the needle on that with significant investments, but it remains a challenging issue going forward, clearly, and one that one would anticipate that the new administration will focus significantly on. There are delays in a significant number of programs, capacity bottlenecks. Submarines has been highlighted, particularly in the context of support for the AUKUS program, but also delivering US Navy capabilities. Those remain challenged and challenging, and will be, I think, a focus further concern, but also in the context of the balance of capabilities going forward, and where the investments and focus on providing new capabilities are concerned between immediate concerns. And we've seen in the recent events globally, from Europe through to the Middle East, that the US Navy has shown, once again, its unique capabilities as far as being able to deploy and provide force on a global scale, but it has clearly stretched their capabilities, and balancing the required investments and the focus on industrial-based development, on providing for the longer term and modernization and building capability in the longer term, and sustaining an operational fleet in the immediate next few years will be another key area of concern, I think.
Maybe if I can add a few more points on the China side to that. Completely concur with what Nick said. There's also, of course, experimentation that's happening in China, not just in terms of building out in vast quantities its surface fleet, but also, of course, in terms of its uncrewed vessels and experimentation there, undersea as well as surface. So in that sense, there is a lot happening in terms of China's maritime capability. China's shipbuilding merger was confirmed last year through an asset swap, after a number of years of it being talked about. So that's finally come to a close. But I would say that there are, of course, two issues that face the PLA Navy and the PLA in general that continue to potentially delay or remain a work in progress towards its modernization goals. And that is issues around skilled talent, and we know that there have been reports last year around the PLA Navy in particularly lacking skilled talent to the extent that it requires for all of this new development. And second of all, experience. Now, on that sense, there has been a lot of activity, as we've noticed in 2024, not just, of course, around Taiwan, but in the South China Sea. How much further afield we see the PLA Navy practicing and exercising alone or in partnerships is also something to watch.
Yeah, thank you so much. We'll take one more question here in the room, and then I'll ask you to maybe pull out two or so from the online groups. Yes, can we get a microphone, the aisle here? Thank you.
Can the UK defend itself against a ballistic missile attack?
Douglas, don't chuckle.
Very succinct answer. In direct terms, no.
Hugh, do you want to pull out one or two online questions before we return?
Certainly can. Yes, so with the increase in European defence spending, what is being prioritised for procurement and capability development?
Sure, if I just jump in terms of the overarching trends, where we're seeing that reorientation, as Bastian said, in top-level spending. A lot of that is procurement rather than R&D. R&D budgets haven't actually increased as an allocation. It's still around 2%, and it's really a handful of countries in Europe that are accounting for the majority of R&D spending in Europe. All of this funding is going, all of this increased funding is going on major recapitalisation efforts, major programs. We're seeing some countries spending in excess of 40% of their budget on recapitalisation. And a lot of this is obviously to do with the replacement of munitions, but also the uptick in capabilities required in terms of urgent operational requirements. So if you consider countries like Poland, the types of capabilities that they are acquiring are really in line with the urgent threats that they're facing within their procurement budget. And I think the other thing to consider is that where more and more countries are highlighting the need to invest more in innovation, the wider issue is that focus towards recapitalisation has squeezed other areas of defence spending across Europe. So now we're starting to see that impact on R&D. We're starting to see that impact on readiness levels, for instance, because we had such a squeeze on personnel spending and operations and maintenance. But I think, yeah, if we hand over to my colleague Tom to discuss the specific capabilities.
If we can get a microphone to Tom, and Doug, I'll put you on notice that you have a chance now to add 2 more sentences about integrated air and missile defense as procurement priority. Tom.
Thanks. Just on what the European countries have been procuring, there's been a surge in procurement spending over the last 3 years, as Fenella mentioned. A lot of that has gone on armour, artillery and air defence, areas that have been underinvested in the decade previously. And in fact, the value of the contracts over the last 3 years are far greater than the 3 years leading up to 2022, and probably of the 10 years leading up to 2022 actually as well. So it's a lot of activity. The problem, though, is capacity and getting those contracts turned into deliveries. It's pretty typical. You sign a contract, you won't get the equipment till 2 or 3 years later. Depends on the equipment type. More complex systems could take even longer. But skilled workers is definitely a challenge. Supply chain that shrunk to meet a reduced demand, that's definitely a challenge as well. But also in Europe, which is a separate problem to what they have, and they don't have this problem in the US, is the attitude to defence, where there's still scepticism about the value of defence, and getting funding for defence companies or even permission from local governments to build factories is very difficult in some places because they just don't want the defence business there. So in those areas, there's still a lot of change to make. Thank you.
Thanks, Tom. Douglas, do you want to perhaps expand a bit on your one-word answer from before in this context of the additional question?
To go back to that question about BMD, the UK cannot defend itself against a ballistic missile strike. Not really. You would have to think a little bit about the kind of nature of the threat, what the weapon was. But against a concentrated ICBM and SLBM strike, absolutely not. The UK does not have that capability. BMD generally is a wicked problem. That includes the US, although obviously has the capacity and the funding to do much more about it than the UK. And in the European context, it remains an issue as well within the wider kind of spread of integrated air and missile defence. IEMD is an ambition in the European context. It's not a reality.
Thank you very much. Nick, I think you had a few naval points to add, and then we can go to
just in the context of where we are now and where we may be going in the future. Such missile defence capabilities as the UK have includes the Type 45 destroyer force. Now, as Douglas suggested, one needs to contextualise your question in terms of what types of ballistic missile one is talking about and what types of threat and scenario. But as has been shown in the Red Sea, both with UK and other European deployments, there is a limited anti-ship ballistic missile capability that has been demonstrated, possibly slightly beyond the formal specification that these ships already have. But there is also a ballistic missile capability development path for the Type 45s, which will at least enhance the sea-based capability to deliver against a limited ballistic missile threat. And in the longer term, into the next decade, there is already the beginnings of thinking on a future replacement for the Type 45s. shorthand for that is Type 83, and I think there will be, not least because it will represent an increasing threat in the naval space, but more generally as well, there will, I'm sure, be an increased emphasis on ballistic missile capability defence for those successor vessels, and that is also already part of the ambition and part of the procurement ambition for a number of other European navies that are also looking at replacement vessels.
Thank you very much. Ben, did you have something on the land side to add?
It's not just for the defence of mainland UK, but it's for the defence of UK forces that are deployed on expeditionary operations. The UK has only that very minimal shipborne capability. Now, if you put this to someone from the MOD, they'll say, but the UK will be working with its allies and will be part of NATO. When we looked at the implications of an all-out war between Russia and NATO, it became quite clear to us that NATO itself doesn't have enough integrated air and missile defence, and despite additional procurements, probably still doesn't. I think there's a wider political issue as well. If we'd been having this meeting 80 years ago, we'd have been in a city under attack by conventional ballistic missiles and cruise missiles. Even if a country doesn't have national ballistic missile defence, it can cut its civilian casualties by half if it has simple civil defence systems like warning and directing people to shelters. And we've seen the effectiveness of that, for example, in Israel recently. So you can't just talk about national ballistic missile defence. You've got to, at the same time, have an uncomfortable conversation between the government and the people and industry about civil defence.
Thank you very much. Good. We've got a more comprehensive answer now. Now we've got a question all the way in the back.
I'll stand up if my knees hold out. It's Robert Fox, Evening Standard. I do detect a large elephant in this room. Possibly it may turn out to be a grey rhino. I'm up with all the buzzwords, or even a black jellyfish. SDR and its implications. Is Britain in danger of being incapable in practical terms of fulfilling its NATO and ally obligations? Or will we continue on the trajectory, since we cannot expect 2.5% of GDP, so we're led to believe until after 2030, that it'll be gestural rather than practical? Subset obligation to allies. Can we really afford the kind of sums that are in prospect for AUKUS and for GCAP? And finally, matching operational capability and readiness, which I find very difficult to parse from what I've been able to see of the military balance so far. How are advanced countries in the NATO alliance going to mitigate what is quite clearly a personnel and recruiting chronic deficiency, which is turning into a crisis in some cases?
Thank you very much. So there are several bits that we might want to get into here, and maybe, Fenella, I'll ask you to start with the fiscal space issue, and then we'll get to the other parts that were in there. Fenella.
Thank you, Bastian, and thank you for the question. Yeah, the fiscal challenges facing the UK and wider Europe are considerable. They're extensive, and I think getting towards the 2.5% is still a difficult decision that will require wider elements of spending to be either adjusted or potentially sacrificed. We're seeing that messaging come in from Europe, that potentially elements of social care or pensions are going to have to be impacted to continue to fund defence at these levels. I think the level of growth that we've seen in European spending in 2024 is going to be incredibly difficult to maintain without some sacrifices. So for all that there is talk of the 3%, the 5%, how feasible that is for countries to reach is becoming increasingly difficult. It took 10 years to get within touching distance of the 2%, and a lot of that growth was within the last 2 years. So it took an invasion of a country on Europe's continent for that shift to happen, for that pivot. So in order for the continuing increases, sacrifices are needed. Within the UK, we are obviously seeing that affordability gap within the equipment plan. It's been fairly sustained. I think there was 1 year where they managed to close the gap and then inflation hit, and they're now still having to cover the costs of that. And that's going to have longer-term ramifications because there are now increased costs for all that inflation has abated. Costs are still incredibly high. A Europe-wide issue, but within the context of the UK, because there was the chronic, if you will, difference or deficit within the equipment plan over its 12-year life so far, that has had ramifications now, and now the decisions are starting to feed through. So without that top-level spending uplift towards 2.5%, there would need to be further cuts announced within this upcoming SDR. The initiatives announced or in the lead up towards a new defence industrial strategy are looking at how to promote UK defence exports and look towards greater partnerships and collaboration as a way to ease pressure on budgets, and we are seeing that across Europe as well, a lot of initiatives. Then the kind of worms of UK third-party access, but beyond that, I think the partnerships that we're seeing grow across Europe and including the UK are a strong signal that the UK is looking towards different ways to try and alleviate some of that pressure on the budget itself. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Maybe I'll turn next to James Hackett to say a few words about the readiness, the recruitment, and those challenges. And then we'll return to the point about UK commitments. James.
Thanks, Bastian. Sorry, it took me a while standing up. On the recruitment point, we covered a lot of this really pressing issue in a book we published last year for the Prague Defence Summit, which I think really highlighted a number of the pinch points across Europe and the measures that countries are looking to take in response in terms of the military personnel issue. Some countries are looking to increase funding to make military service more attractive. Some are looking to change career structures. The Haythornthwaite review into personnel in this country looked at zigzag career structures, ways of accommodating technically literate people and the younger generation that might not want to spend all their time in military service. Some countries are examining standards, and I'll direct you to a really interesting New Yorker article that appeared only last week on that issue for US armed forces. And some countries are also looking to reintroduce and to expand conscription, as we've seen in East European and Nordic states in recent years. So it's a pressing issue that a number of countries are looking to address in different ways. But one of the challenges, I think, in Western Europe is there's a growing gap in the sort of age cohort of the population with direct experience of military service, either through familial military service or direct service themselves. So people are really unfamiliar in some cases with the demands required of them and of national security requirements that they may be called upon to deliver and address. And that's a really thorny question for governments in terms of how they acclimatise the population to the demands that might be placed on them. With that, I'll stop.
Thanks, James. Ben, maybe on the UK commitment to NATO?
Robert, the answer to your direct question is yes, and I'll expand on it. A year ago, the House of Commons Defence Committee produced a report unveiling really significant weaknesses in British military readiness, including undermanning, including stockpiles of ammunition and spare parts. Now, both the previous government and this government have directed some money to filling in these holes in the road, including more expenditure on ammunition, resuming ammunition and spare part production. But it's difficult to see that can fill the whole gap. And this was endorsed, in a sense, by John Healey, who basically said, whilst the British Armed Forces can do operations of the sorts they're doing, including those in the Middle East, they're not capable of fighting a war. And my judgment is that if a British force at, say, medium scale is dispatched to a high-intensity conflict against a peer or near-peer opponent, the British force would take more casualties and take longer to achieve its mission than, say, a US force. And, of course, the US probably know that with reduced British military influence in Washington, D.C. as a result. So what is to be done? Well, there is a choice between what the army calls fight tonight. So, you know, having the force as ready as it can be in the short term to conduct military operations, or fight tomorrow, which is long-term investment for the future. And obviously the Global Combat Air Programme and the IISS submarine programme is very much fight tomorrow. Very difficult judgments for the Ministry of Defence and the government to make. There are a couple of key known unknowns, Robert. One is, by what date does the government require the British Armed Forces to be ready to fight war? Because if it requires it to be ready to fight war in the short term, then a hell of a lot of money needs to be put into filling those short-term capability gaps. But the longer out that objective to be able to fight war, the more money can go to the fight tomorrow issue. But I'm afraid it's my judgment, based on all these the experience, that even with an increase in the defence budget to 2.5%, there is insufficient money there to sustain all the capabilities that Britain wants to sustain, particularly in terms of meeting its NATO commitment. So there's one other sort of inconvenient question that needs to be put, is to what extent does this particular government consider that investing in defence in terms of its people, equipment and activity is an act that supports its main objective of national growth?
Thank you very much. I just wanted to see whether there are any brief additions to this. Otherwise, Douglas, did you want to? Yeah?
Yeah, I mean, just directly on GCAP and the Global Combat Air Programme. I mean, in a sense, Robert, you can ask, can we afford it? I think you can turn the question around almost and can we not afford it, at least in terms of the capability requirements that we're going to be looking for in the 2040s. I mean, the threat environment then is going to be much worse than it is today, and it's bad enough today. So from a capability perspective, you need to do something, be it GCAP or be it something else. From an industrial perspective, it is a kind of watershed moment for the UK in terms of defence aerospace. If you don't have GCAP, what do? Probably you end up pretty much buying American. So you effectively take the UK out of that business. If you look at the government's prosperity agenda, GCAP plays into that. And there's also the final point I would make, and I think this probably spins over to AUKUS as well, is if we do back away from those programmes, how are we seen as a reliable partner amongst our allies?
Thank you very much. So let's, Nick, if you want to add 45 seconds on AUKUS, and then we've got 2 questions from the online questions that we'll come to next. Nick.
Yes, just I mean, endorse to some extent what Douglas was saying, but you know, Ben's right. I mean, where we are now has increased that exquisite challenge of balancing urgent operational requirements versus long-term investments. But as far as AUKUS is concerned, yes, you know, nuclear is eye-wateringly expensive, but there is the cost, and then there's the strategic dividend issue, and you know, potentially this. Or you know, AUKUS in some ways spreads the costs and increases the economies of scale if the ambition is to stay within the nuclear-powered submarine business, which is a UK national ambition, both in terms of NATO commitments and more broad power projection. It's also, I would venture, a key, allied requirement as far as a UK contribution into the NATO context as well in the longer term.
Thank you very much. Hugh, may I ask you to pull out the 2 questions from the online group, and then...
Sure. So the first one is regarding the delivery of F-16s and other Western aircraft to Ukraine. What impact might that have?
And then let's add the second one as well, and then we can go one by one.
Okay.
So that one is for Douglas, and then...
And what impact has corruption within the PLA had on capability?
Okay, so that one is for Mayor, so Douglas and then Mayor.
So Western combat aircraft into Ukraine, the F-16 and the Mirage. Obviously political signalling, continued support has an operational impact on the Russians in that they have to honour that threat, that it provides potentially a greater threat in terms of Russia's own air operations, so they have to take that into account.
Maya?
Sure, thank you. On terms of the impact of PLA corruption investigations on capability, I think we have to recognize the breadth of these investigations, not just across the PLA rocket force in the last year, but also, of course, touching on other services, including the now disbanded Strategic Support Force this year and late last year, some questions around the Navy, and of course also the way that it impacted and expanded to China's defense industrial base as well. That being said, I think recognizing that corruption investigations in the Chinese context can serve two purposes. One, rooting out real corruption to do around opportunities that might have been presented in procurement processes. And second of all, of course, use as a political tool. So if we think about these two different uses of corruption investigations, I'd say the disruption to the PLA's longer-term modernization progress is limited. There will be short-term disruption, but it doesn't necessarily present a game-changing deal breaker for longer-term ambitions. Thanks.
Thank you very much. So return to the room here. There's a question all the way in the back. Yeah.
Hi, Latika Burke, the Nightly Australia. I want to ask you, I mean, this is a ledger of military capabilities, but to contextualise it, particularly for the Indo-Pacific, I think, Bastian, you mentioned at the start that China was at the point of being able to outpace or erode US dominance in the Indo-Pacific. If it's a hot war now, who's got the better capability? I'm not talking about the actual ledger and balance. Who do we think still retains the capability edge?
Thank you very much. So that'll probably take us through the 3 minutes that we have left. So maybe the way to tackle that is that we talk a little bit about where technological advantage has been eroding and where the PLA has made significant progress, and actually the balance therefore is changing. Henry, do you want to start on this one, and then we'll turn to colleagues?
I think you can make a strong case that in a lot of areas, I mean, it's contextual on where you expect a conflict to break out, and China has many advantages in terms of time and distance for a fight in the Taiwan Strait that it just doesn't if you were thinking about the conflict in Australia's backyard and the west coast of the US. I think there are some very specific areas of capability, and pretty broad range of them, where China is as either a leader or a strong competitor. Current capabilities in space domain, air-to-air warfare, also some aspects of both integrated air and missile defense and its own long-range standoff missile capabilities, ground-based missile capabilities that the US is now currently still building up its own alternatives to. I think there's also question marks and the vice versa in terms of continuing Chinese weaknesses in the undersea domain, and also in terms of its both in terms of its own submarine capacity, but it's also its ASW warfare that still continues to rumble around in terms of PLA and modernisation. I suspect both of my colleagues to my left and my right will have more to say about that.
Nick, do you want to say a little bit about the naval aspects of this? And then Douglas probably on.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the naval space, you know, there's been much discussion around the fact that, you know, in terms of numbers of hulls, you know, the PLA Navy is ahead of the US Navy, but that is a very rough estimate. But in terms of overall capability, the US Navy, you know, currently has an advantage. Its problem, which Henry hinted at, is that it is globally dispersed, whereas at the moment the PLA Navy is more concentrated and has, given some of the scenarios that we are postulating, it sort of has more of a home advantage. The one area where in the naval space there is still a sense of the US having an asymmetric advantage, but is under pressure, and the gap may be closing, is, and I mentioned it earlier, is in the submarine space and in the subsea space, where they still have very significant capability advantage, but China is moving ahead in that space, and the subsea space is itself changing. Technological advances that Maya talked about around uncrewed systems, networks of undersea systems. All of those mean that it will be, if you'll pardon the pun, a very fluid space going forward.
Thank you very much. So let me ask Douglas to say a few words about air, and then Maya perhaps wrap up with how China looks at this itself and how it looks to the PLA.
Yeah, very briefly on the air side of the house, has the absolute gap closed between the USAF and the PLAAF? Absolutely. They've benefited from sustained and substantial investment for decades, and you're now seeing the results of that. They also benefit from basically being able to configure to do one fight. They have one task in a way. Where the US and its allies probably still have an advantage is to put the hardware to one side, training, combat experience. Obviously, it's an area which, thankfully, the Chinese haven't had a great deal of combat experience recently. Thank you.
Thank you. Maya.
That's a really nice segue, Doug, because that's exactly what I was going to say in terms of how the PLA regards itself. And that ledger aside, I mean, just even thinking about the ledger, the way that I think they would describe themselves is probably untested. And so that in of itself is perhaps a deterrent from a PLA perspective and a CCP perspective. But that experience part, the softer angles of PLA modernization are still very much a work in progress. And it's not just, I think, about the kind of real-world combat experience that they're lacking, but also testing things like command and control and how they work in not just crisis, but conflict situations, whether or not exercises and drills are expanding at the rate and to the scope that they are required, to what extent integration between the services and across the now 4 support arms is in fact in place and successful. And lastly, I think the question that we also need to ask when we look at this ledger and areas where the PLA might still have weaknesses or deficiencies compared to Western militaries is whether or not we actually think that that is still a deficiency or whether the PLA plans to fight in a completely different way. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That concludes the Military Balance 2025 launch. Thank you very much for joining us here in person, and also thank you for those who joined us online. I hope you all find the Military Balance very helpful and useful in your work. There is, of course, also a database, the Military Balance Plus, that always has our very latest assessment on all of these questions. Thank you very much. Have a good rest of the day. Thank you.